Here's something worth thinking about. Millions of people around the world consider themselves true BTS fans. They know the discography, the members' birthdays, the behind-the-scenes moments, the fan theories. And yet, even the most dedicated army often has no idea just how many layers this group actually has. Not the kind of layers you find in glossy magazine profiles or polished press interviews, the real ones, the kind buried in industry data, cultural history, and decisions made in small rooms long before anyone was paying attention. BTS's story is genuinely unusual, not because it's been packaged that way, but because the facts themselves are difficult to explain by conventional logic. How does a group from a mid-sized Korean label end up reshaping the global music industry? How does a fan base become a cultural force in its own right? And what exactly has been happening behind everything you've seen on stage? 7 facts. Some of them you've heard pieces of. Most of them probably not the full picture. One of them, number 3, is the kind of thing that makes you stop and reconsider everything you thought you knew about what's actually possible in this industry. Let's get into it. Number 7, a tough start. To understand what BTS became, you have to understand what they started from, because the gap between the two is enormous, and most people have no real sense of just how wide it was. BTS debuted on June 13, 2013, under Big Hit Entertainment. That company name today carries serious weight in the global music industry. In 2013, it did not. Big Hit was a small operation, around 20 employees total, that had experienced some early success with another act, but was, by most industry accounts, struggling financially heading into BTS's debut. This was not a well-resourced launch. There was no massive promotional budget, no heavyweight media backing, no strategic alliance with one of Korea's big 3 entertainment conglomerates. BTS stepped onto the stage with No More Dream, a hip-hop track that was aggressive, direct, and deliberately different from what most idol groups were releasing at the time, and the industry largely shrugged. The debut performance didn't generate a cultural moment. It didn't chart in ways that made label executives nervous. In the highly competitive landscape of K-pop in 2013, where groups from SM, JYP, and YG Entertainment dominated the conversation and controlled a disproportionate share of broadcast airtime and promotional real estate, a group from Big Hit simply wasn't positioned to break through easily. Resources translated directly to visibility, and Big Hit had limited resources. The members themselves came from a range of different backgrounds, and several of them carried histories that didn't fit the conventional idol trajectory. RM, Kim Namjoon, had been an underground rapper since his early teens, releasing music under the name Runch Randa through the South Korean underground hip-hop scene. He had genuine street credibility within that community, but was an unconventional choice to anchor a mainstream idol group. Suga, born Min Yuangi in Daegu, had made the decision to pursue music in a city that wasn't Seoul, against the wishes of his family, working part-time jobs to support himself while he chased a career that had no guaranteed outcome. He's spoken in interviews about eating poorly, about the financial pressure of those years, about what it actually cost, not metaphorically but literally, to be there. J-Hope had been a trainee at JYP Entertainment before eventually finding his way to Big Hit. Jungkook auditioned for multiple agencies, a standard practice for trainees, and received several offers, but chose Big Hit specifically because of RM. He was 15 years old. That decision, made by a teenager based on being impressed by one person's talent in an audition room, turned out to be one of the more consequential choices in modern pop music history. But in 2013, it just looked like a kid joining a small company with uncertain prospects. The early dorm conditions that members have described in interviews and documented through their own content, BTS was active on social media and video platforms from very early on, which was a deliberate strategy, were not comfortable. Multiple members sharing cramped living space, tight budgets, limited food, and the constant pressure of practicing and performing at a level expected by the industry while not yet generating the revenue to match those expectations. These weren't hardships being romanticized in retrospect. They were the practical reality of being an unknown group at an under-resourced label. Their first 2 years produced a school-themed trilogy of releases, Too Cool for School, Oh Are You 8-2, and School Love Affair, that developed a small but genuinely devoted following. The content was more personal and more lyrically direct than much of what was charting at the time. BTS wrote and co-produced significant portions of their own material, which was not the norm for new idol groups. That creative involvement gave their music a texture that resonated with listeners who were looking for something more specific than polished mainstream production. But resonating with a core audience and breaking through are two different things, and in 2013 and 2014, they were still firmly in the first category. The turning point that most fans point to is the Most Beautiful Moment in Life era in 2015. That 2-part album series, which dealt with youth, anxiety, fleeting happiness, and the specific pain of growing up, connected in a way their earlier work hadn't at scale. I Need You became their first song to win on a music show. Their first real taste of mainstream recognition came over 2 years into their career, following a period that had tested every person involved, from the members to the staff to Bong Si-hyuk himself, who had taken a significant financial gamble on this particular group. There is something important in that timeline. The standard K-pop industry model in that era expected groups to establish themselves within a relatively short window. Groups that didn't generate momentum early were often restructured, members were sometimes replaced, and in some cases the project was quietly shelved. Big Hit's position was precarious enough that this wasn't an abstract risk, it was a real possibility hovering over the group's early years. What prevented that outcome was a combination of factors: the members' own commitment and creative output, the decision to build directly with fans through social media rather than relying on broadcast gatekeepers, and the particular quality of the music they were making. None of those factors were accidental. They were the result of choices made under pressure, with limited resources, by people who didn't have the luxury of patience, but had to manufacture it anyway. BTS did not succeed because everything aligned for them. They succeeded because very little did, and they kept going regardless. That foundation, built slowly, built hard, is what made everything that came next possible. And once the momentum started, the scale of what they were about to achieve off stage was something that almost nobody in the industry had seen coming.
Number 6. Personalities beyond the stage. There's a version of BTS that exists in performance, in the choreography, the press appearances, the carefully lit concert stages. And then there's the version that exists in practice rooms at 2 in the morning, in airport transit lounges, in the unscripted moments their own cameras have caught over the years. Those two versions overlap, but they are not identical, and the gap between them tells you more about who these 7 people actually are than almost any interview ever could. Start with RM, Kim Namjoon, because he is, in many ways, the hardest member to reduce to a simple description. He speaks English fluently, which he has said he learned primarily by watching the American sitcom Friends repeatedly over years, without formal instruction. He scored in the top percentile on South Korea's National College Entrance Exam, the Suneung, before choosing music over the conventional academic path. He's delivered speeches at the United Nations. He reads literary theory in his spare time. None of that is staged. What's less discussed is his other well-documented trait. He breaks things, constantly. The members gave him the nickname God of Destruction not as a joke about his intellect, but as a literal description: glasses, equipment, items in their shared spaces. The man has a documented relationship with accidental destruction that has become one of the more reliably consistent facts of his existence. The combination of philosophical depth and inexplicable physical clumsiness is genuinely not something that gets manufactured by a PR team. Jin, Kim Sek-jin, was the eldest and perhaps the most openly committed to being funny in a way that required no performance skill whatsoever. His dad jokes are legendarily bad, and he tells them with the confidence of someone who has fully accepted this about himself. He studied acting at Konkuk University before music took over entirely. Off-camera, members have consistently described him as someone who takes care of the group in practical terms, the one who makes sure people are fed, who maintains normalcy in the middle of chaos. He was scouted on the street by a big-hit talent agent when he was a university student in 2011, which means his entry into this entire story was essentially accidental, and he's leaned into the absurdity of that ever since. Suga, Min Yugi, operates at the opposite end of the energy spectrum. His public persona involves a visible reluctance towards social performance that he rarely bothers to disguise. He has been open, across multiple interviews and in his music, about living with depression and social anxiety disorder, openly, without softening it, in a cultural context where that kind of disclosure carries real professional risk. His mixtapes, as AGD, are among the most lyrically raw releases in BTS's catalog, dealing directly with mental health, identity, and the cost of the life he chose. The contrast between that vulnerability in music and his carefully dry, economical presence in variety show contexts is not contradiction. It's just a person who expresses differently in different registers, which is an entirely human thing to do. J-Hope, Jung Hosak, is known as the group's mood maker, and that description is accurate but incomplete. He was a street dancer in Gwangju before becoming a trainee, with a technical foundation in dance that predates his idol career by years. The perpetually energized performance persona is real, but he's also spoken candidly about the weight of being expected to carry the group's emotional atmosphere, the pressure of positivity that comes with being the person others look to when things are difficult. His solo project, Jack in the Box, released in 2022, went significantly darker in tone than anything his stage persona suggested was coming. The gap between the public expectation and the private reality had been there all along. Jimin, Park Jimin, trained in contemporary dance at Busan Arts High School, where he graduated at the top of his class in the contemporary dance department. That technical background shows in his performance precision, but what's documented offstage is something related, a perfectionism that has caused him to delete or withhold music he felt wasn't ready. He's spoken in interviews about discarding finished work that didn't meet his own standards. This is not the behavior of someone performing dedication for an audience. It's the behavior of someone for whom the standard is genuinely internal and genuinely high. V, Kim Tae-young, has a widely reported origin story that's worth stating plainly. He went to an audition in Daegu accompanying a friend, was persuaded by staff to audition himself on the spot, and got in. He is self-taught on saxophone and has demonstrated genuine interest in visual art, photography, and film in ways that have shown up consistently across years of documented behavior, not as talking points, but as actual recurring activities during time off. Members have described him as unpredictable in day-to-day life, and the archive of unscripted footage largely supports that. His personality doesn't follow an obvious pattern, which makes him genuinely interesting to watch in uncontrolled settings. Jungkook joined Big Hit at 15, which means he grew up inside this group. He had no real adult life outside of it during his formative years. The members were functionally his primary family for the majority of his adolescence. He's demonstrated a range of skills: singing, dancing, sports including boxing and archery, visual art, photography, consistently enough that the Golden Maknae label isn't just fan flattery. The more interesting detail is what's happened as he's gotten older. The shy teenager who barely spoke in early interviews gradually became one of the more expressive and visually daring members of the group, someone still figuring out who he is, on his own terms rather than as the youngest. 7 people. 7 genuinely different ways of being in the world. What's notable is that these personalities, not the performance versions but the actual ones, have always been legible if you paid attention. The group never hid them, and it's part of why the fan base has always felt, right or not, that they actually knew these people. Now the real question is what those 7 people have been putting into their work, because some of it is hiding in plain sight.
Number 5. Small details with big meaning. Most pop music operates on the surface. You hear it, you feel something, and that's the complete transaction. BTS has consistently done something different, layered their work with references so specific that casual listeners can miss them entirely, while fans who dig deeper find a second text running underneath the first. This isn't coincidence, and it isn't fan projection. It's intentional, documented, and in several cases, the group and the label have confirmed the source material directly. Start with the Wings album, released in October 2016. Before the album dropped, BTS released a series of 7 short films, 1 per member, under the same title. Each film drew explicitly from Hermann Hesse's novel, Jimin, published in 1919. The opening line of that novel, "I wanted only to live in accord with the promptings which came from my true inner self. Why was that so very difficult?" appeared in the concept material. Jimin is a coming-of-age story about a young man named Emile Sinclair navigating the boundary between innocence and knowledge, light and darkness, the self presented to the world and the self that exists underneath it. Each member's short film mapped onto specific themes from the book: temptation, identity fracture, the search for an authentic self. This wasn't surface-level borrowing. The thematic architecture of the Wings era was built on Hesse's framework, and understanding the novel genuinely changes how the music reads. Big Hit confirmed the influence directly. It was not a fan theory. The follow-up was even more explicit. The Map of the Soul series, beginning with Persona in 2019, was built on the psychological framework of Carl Jung, specifically Murray Stein's book Jung's Map of the Soul, an introduction, which was publicly cited by the label as a core reference. Jung's model of the psyche identifies the persona as the social mask an individual presents to the world, the curated self. The shadow is the repressed, unacknowledged aspect of personality, the parts of the self that don't fit the mask and get pushed down. The ego is the conscious center, the observer. BTS turned this theoretical framework into a 3-part album structure: persona, shadow, and ego. RM's persona, Suga's shadow, and the full group's ego each directly engage with their corresponding Jungian concept in terms of both lyrical content and visual treatment. This is not a group gesturing vaguely at philosophy for aesthetic credibility. It is a sustained, coherent engagement with a specific theoretical text across multiple releases. Then there is Spring Day. Released in February 2017, the song is openly about missing someone who is absent, longing across distance, the specific grief of waiting for a person who isn't coming back. The music video takes place largely on and around a train and at an empty resort. At one point, the video shows a massive pile of clothing and shoes heaped together at what appears to be a train station. That image is a direct reference to Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. In that story, a seemingly perfect city maintains its happiness on a single, unbearable condition. One child must be kept in misery, locked away so that everyone else can flourish. Those who cannot accept this bargain walk away from Omelas, into the unknown, towards something unnamed. The pile of clothing in the MV mirrors the abandoned belongings in the story. The train, movement, departure, the choice to leave, connects directly to Le Guin's central moral question about collective happiness built on hidden suffering.
Spring Day has also been widely and persistently interpreted as a tribute to the victims of the Sewol ferry disaster of April 16, 2014, in which a ferry sank off the coast of South Korea, killing 304 people, the majority of them high school students on a field trip. The disaster became a defining national trauma. The references in the song and video, the shoes, the waiting, the unresolved grief, the imagery of people who are simply gone, align with the emotional context of Sewol in ways that are difficult to read as coincidental. Big Hit has never officially confirmed or denied this interpretation, but the song was released on the anniversary window of that event, and the resonance has been acknowledged widely enough in South Korean media that it has become part of the song's documented cultural reception. Black Swan from Map of the Soul 7 in 2020 opens with a quote attributed to Martha Graham, the pioneering American choreographer. "A dancer dies twice, once when they stop dancing, and this first death is the more painful." The song is written from the perspective of an artist confronting the fear that they might one day feel nothing while performing, that the work that once moved them might go silent. The Black Swan in the title draws from the broader concept of an unforeseen, high-impact event, something that reframes everything that came before it. The specific fear BTS is describing in that song, the death of passion within a living career, is not generic artist angst. It is a precise, named fear that requires both the Graham reference and the conceptual framework of the title to fully land. What makes all of this significant is the consistency. One literary reference is a creative choice. A philosophical framework used across a multi-album arc is a working method. A specific visual image in a music video that points directly to a 1973 short story is an argument that the audience is worth the effort of engaging seriously. Across a decade of releases, BTS has treated their catalog as a space where ideas have consequences, where the thing underneath the surface is as real as the surface itself. If you've been listening without reading the footnotes, you've heard the music, but you've only heard part of the conversation. And what that conversation has helped build, the scale of what came next, is something the music industry is still trying to fully account for.
Number 4. A journey to the world stage. The phrase going global gets used loosely in the music industry. A song charts in 2 countries. A tour hits 3 continents. And suddenly a group is described as a worldwide phenomenon. What BTS did between 2017 and 2022 doesn't fit neatly into that category. The scale was different, the mechanisms were different, and the implications extended well beyond music in ways that took the industry a while to fully process. The first concrete signal that something unusual was happening came in 2017. BTS won the Top Social Artist Award at the Billboard Music Awards, an award previously won by Justin Bieber for 6 consecutive years. This was the first time a Korean act had won a Billboard Music Award of any kind. The win made news not just in the K-pop community but in mainstream entertainment media, largely because nobody in the American industry had been tracking BTS closely enough to anticipate it. Their fan base had been mobilizing on social media at a scale that simply hadn't registered in the traditional metrics that American label executives were watching. By 2018, the trajectory had become impossible to ignore. Their Love Yourself Tear album debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200, making BTS the first Korean act to reach the top of that chart. They followed it the same year with Love Yourself Answer, which also debuted at number 1. 2 Billboard 200 number 1 albums in a single calendar year, in Korean, from a group that had no significant American radio presence. That combination of facts did not fit any existing framework the industry had for how international acts succeeded in the United States. In September 2018, RM stood at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly Hall in New York and delivered a speech for UNICEF's Generation Unlimited initiative. He spoke in Korean, not English, before an audience of world leaders. The speech, which addressed young people's right to speak and be heard, was not a ceremonial gesture. It was broadcast globally and watched by millions. For BTS to be standing in that room at that point in their career, not as entertainment but as representatives of a generation, said something about the kind of cultural authority they had accumulated in an unusually short time. Their live footprint grew proportionally. The 2019 Love Yourself, Speak Yourself Stadium tour included performances at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California, Soldier Field in Chicago, MetLife Stadium in New Jersey, and 2 sold-out nights at Wembley Stadium in London. The Rose Bowl show was the first time a Korean act had headlined a major American stadium. Wembley held approximately 90,000 people per night. These were not special events manufactured around a crossover moment. They were standard dates on a world tour that had sold out arenas and stadiums across North America, Europe, and Asia. The logistics of managing that scale, production, security, ticketing, placed BTS operationally in the same category as the largest grossing touring acts in the world. The South Korean government formally recognized what was happening in 2018, awarding BTS the Wagwon Order of Cultural Merit, one of South Korea's highest civilian honors. They were the youngest recipients of that honor in its history. The government's rationale was explicit. BTS had elevated international awareness of Korean culture to a degree that conventional diplomatic channels could not replicate. Then came Dynamite in August 2020, released during a period when the pandemic had shut down live performance globally. The song, BTS's first recorded entirely in English, debuted at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was the first time a Korean act had reached the top of that chart. It streamed 33.9 million times in the United States in its first week alone. The following year, Butter debuted at #1 on the Hot 100, and then Permission to Dance repeated that achievement, making BTS one of the very few acts in the chart's history to have multiple songs debut directly at the top position. In May 2022, BTS visited the White House to meet with President Joe Biden. The stated purpose was to discuss anti-Asian discrimination and hate crimes, a substantive policy conversation, not a photo opportunity. The fact that they were in that room for that reason at that moment reflected how far their cultural reach had extended beyond music. They were not being received as celebrities. They were being received as people whose platform and credibility gave them genuine standing in a policy discussion. In September 2021, South Korean President Moon Jae-in appointed all 7 BTS members as special presidential envoys for future generations and culture. They traveled with him to New York and addressed the United Nations again, this time at the SDG moment ahead of the 76th General Assembly, speaking on climate change, vaccination equity, and the challenges facing young people globally. They spoke partly in Korean, partly in English. The address was broadcast live by the UN. The economic dimension of all this was quantified, conservatively, by a 2019 report from the Hybe Research Institute, which estimated that BTS was contributing approximately 4.65 trillion Korean won, roughly equivalent to $4.1 billion to South Korea's economy annually. The report estimated that their influence was attracting close to 800,000 additional tourists to South Korea each year. The Korea Tourism Organization had already been tracking what they called the BTS effect on inbound travel from the United States, Japan, China, and Southeast Asia. This is a group that started from a label with 20 employees, in a country whose music had almost no commercial presence in Western markets a decade earlier, and ended up delivering policy speeches at the United Nations, headlining Wembley Stadium, and generating measurable effects on national tourism numbers. The infrastructure that made all of that possible was not just the group's talent or the label's strategy. It was something else entirely. Something that was building alongside BTS at every stage of this journey, and whose role in what happened is genuinely difficult to overstate.
Number 3. Unbelievable achievements. Numbers, at a certain scale, stop feeling real. They become abstractions large enough to register as impressive, but too large to actually picture. What's worth doing with BTS's achievement record is not just listing the figures, but placing them in enough context that the actual weight of what happened becomes legible. Because some of what this group has accomplished in roughly a decade does not have a clear precedent, and the music industry's standard frameworks for measuring success genuinely struggled to contain it. Start with the Billboard Hot 100, because that's where the argument becomes most concrete. Dynamite, released August 2020, debuted at #1. That fact has been reported widely enough that it may have lost some of its impact, so consider what it actually required. The Billboard Hot 100 has been running since 1958. In over 6 decades of chart history, a Korean act had never reached number 1. It didn't happen gradually, through weeks of climbing. Dynamite entered at the top position. Butter, released May 2021, did the same, debuted at number 1, and then held that position for 6 consecutive weeks before eventually being displaced and returning to number 1 again, spending a total of 10 non-consecutive weeks at the chart's peak across the summer of 2021. Permission to Dance then debuted at number 1 in July 2021, making BTS the first act since the Beatles to have 3 songs debut at number 1 in a single calendar year. The Beatles comparison is not fan hyperbole. It is the factual result of applying Billboard's own historical data. On YouTube, the scale was similarly outside normal parameters. The music video for Boy with Love, featuring Halsey, reached 100 million views in 37 hours and 37 minutes, a YouTube record at the time of its release in April 2019. Butter's music video generated 108.2 million views in its first 24 hours on the platform, setting a record for most views in a single day upon release. BTS holds multiple Guinness World Records related to YouTube performance, the fastest videos to reach specific view milestones, records for most viewed clips within set time windows. These are not awards voted on by fans. They are measured, audited, third-party verified figures. On Spotify, DNA became the first K-pop song to surpass 1 billion streams on the platform. That threshold, 1 billion streams, represents a number of individual listens that has no intuitive human scale. It crossed that line not in English, not with American radio support, but as a Korean-language pop song by a group that had no significant Western label distribution infrastructure behind it when the song was released. In South Korea itself, the domestic records broke their own precedents repeatedly. Map of the Soul, Persona, released in April 2019, sold over 2.13 million copies in its first week, the highest first-week sales in South Korean music history at that time. Map of the Soul, 7, released in February 2020, surpassed it, with pre-orders alone exceeding 4 million copies. These were not streaming numbers. These were physical album units, a format that the global industry had largely written off as commercially marginal everywhere except parts of East Asia. The institutional recognition accumulated in parallel. Time magazine named BTS their Entertainer of the Year for 2020, a year in which the group released Map of the Soul. 7, saw their planned world tour cancelled by the pandemic, pivoted to online concerts that generated their own records, and released Dynamite to number 1. They appeared on multiple Time covers across different years and were included in the Time 100 Most Influential People list. These are not fan polls or social media metrics. Time's editorial selections reflect the magazine's own assessment of global cultural impact. The American Music Awards named BTS Artist of the Year for 2021. They won the Top Social Artist Award at the Billboard Music Awards for 6 consecutive years, from 2017 to 2022, a run that eclipsed the previous record held by Justin Bieber. They received Grammy nominations for Best Pop Duo/Group Performance for Dynamite in 2021 and Butter in 2022. The Grammy recognition matters not only as validation, but as evidence of how far the Recording Academy's own frame of reference had shifted. An institution historically focused on American and Anglophone music, formally acknowledging a Korean language group as competitive within its categories. The corporate dimension of BTS's achievement may be the least discussed and the most structurally significant. When Big Hit Entertainment held its initial public offering on the Korea Stock Exchange on October 15, 2020, the company's stock opened at 270,000 Korean won per share, double its IPO price of 135,000 won. On opening day, Big Hit's market capitalization briefly exceeded 10 trillion Korean won. A company that had approximately 20 employees when BTS debuted in 2013 became one of the largest entertainment IPOs in South Korean financial history 7 years later. The 7 members of BTS were shareholders. The group's success had, in measurable financial terms, built a publicly traded corporation. What connects all of these figures is something that isn't captured in any individual statistic: the absence of the infrastructure that was supposed to be required. Korean acts were not supposed to reach #1 on the Hot 100 without American label backing, without English language radio, without the conventional machinery of Western market entry. BTS did it with Korean language songs first, then confirmed it with English releases after the fact. The framework that the global music industry had built to explain how international success was achieved did not account for them. They didn't fit the model. They just kept generating the results. And none of it, not the chart records, not the Grammy nominations, not the stadium tours, not the UN speeches, happened in isolation from the people who chose to stay engaged at every stage of the group's existence. That relationship is more complex and more consequential than it's usually given credit for. Number 2. ARMY plays a huge role. Every successful music act has fans. What BTS has is something that operates differently in scale, in organization, in cultural reach, and in the specific ways it has shaped outcomes that would otherwise have required major label infrastructure, traditional media access, or significant promotional budgets to achieve. Understanding what ARMY actually is and what ARMY has actually done requires looking past the general concept of a dedicated fan base and examining the specific, documented behavior of this particular community. ARMY, the name standing for Adorable Representative MC for Youth, was officially established on July 9, 2013, less than a month after BTS debuted. The name was deliberate. BTS translates to Bulletproof Boy Scouts, and an army stays behind bulletproof armor. The relationship was coded into the identity of both entities from the beginning, not retrofitted once success arrived. The early strategy BTS and Big Hit adopted toward their fan base was unusual for the K-pop industry at the time. Rather than managing fan access through carefully controlled official channels, the group was actively encouraged to maintain a direct, frequent, unfiltered presence on social media. They posted behind-the-scenes content, practice footage, personal vlogs, and real-time updates at a rate that was genuinely unprecedented for a major idol act. Fans were not consuming a product from a distance, they were being brought inside the process. The effect of that access on fan investment was significant and, over time, became one of the clearest competitive advantages BTS had over acts with more conventional promotional strategies. What ARMY built on those foundations was not just loyalty, it was fluency. They understood the group in enough detail to translate, contextualize, and advocate for them in markets and communities where BTS had no official presence. That translation function is worth taking seriously as a structural contribution. In the years before BTS had widespread official subtitle and translation support, fan communities had already built networks of dedicated translators producing subtitles and transcripts in dozens of languages. Content that would otherwise have been accessible only to Korean speakers became reachable across Southeast Asia, Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East because fans had done the work of making it so. The global reach that eventually drew the attention of international media and industry figures was, in significant part, built by unpaid labor from engaged community members who wanted more people to have access to what they had found. The organizational capacity of ARMY became nationally visible in June 2020. Following widespread protests across the United States after the killing of George Floyd, BTS donated $1 million to Black Lives Matter organizations. Within 24 hours, a fan-organized campaign, operating under the name Match a Million, coordinated through Twitter with no official backing from any label or management, had raised over $1 million from ARMY members globally to match that donation. The campaign organized, fundraised, and delivered a seven-figure sum in less than a day. The speed and scale of that response was not the behavior of a passive audience. It was the behavior of a community with existing organizational infrastructure, trust networks, and a demonstrated capacity for rapid collective action. Charitable mobilization has been a consistent pattern throughout ARMY's history, not an isolated event. Fan organizations, including one in an ARMY, have coordinated donations to causes across multiple countries in BTS members' names, on birthdays, anniversaries, and in response to current events. The BTS and UNICEF Love Myself campaign, launched in November 2017 to support UNICEF's Yen violence program, raised over $3 million through a combination of official merchandise proceeds and fan contributions by 2020. ARMY was not peripheral to that campaign. They were a primary driver of its reach and fundraising performance. On the charts, ARMY's behavior has been documented and analyzed by music industry observers as a distinct phenomenon. When Butter debuted at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in May 2021, the fan community had spent weeks circulating detailed, methodologically specific guides on how to stream correctly to maximize chart impact, which platforms counted, which listening behaviors registered, which time windows were most significant for weekly chart calculations. The sophistication of that coordination, applied at the scale of tens of millions of people, produced chart outcomes that analysts could track directly. Butter spent 6 consecutive weeks at #1 upon release and returned to #1 later, for a total of 10 non-consecutive weeks at the top position. The streaming volume behind those numbers was not organic in the conventional sense. It was organized, deliberate, and effective. BTS's 6 consecutive wins in the top social artist category at the Billboard Music Awards from 2017 to 2022 were driven entirely by fan voting and social media engagement. Twitter, now X, named BTS the most tweeted about musician globally across multiple years during that period. The platform's own data confirmed that BTS-related content was generating engagement at volumes that exceeded those of any other musical act. That output came from ARMY. Every tweet, reply, retweet, and trending hashtag was produced by individual members of a community acting both spontaneously and, in many cases, through organized campaign efforts. Hybe's response to this community was the development of Weverse, a dedicated fan platform launched in 2019. The platform was designed specifically to host the kind of direct interaction between artists and fans that had characterized BTS's relationship with ARMY from the beginning. It has since expanded to include multiple other acts and accumulated tens of millions of users, a commercial enterprise built directly on the infrastructure of fan engagement that BTS and ARMY had been developing together for years. The relationship between BTS and ARMY is not easily categorized. It is not standard artist-fan dynamics, it is not a managed fan base, and it is not a marketing strategy. It is something that developed through sustained, mutual engagement over time and produced outcomes, charitable, commercial, cultural, that neither party could have achieved independently. BTS has said this directly in speeches and interviews, consistently enough that it cannot be read as performance. ARMY is not separate from their story. ARMY is the story, running in parallel to everything else. And what BTS has done with that foundation, the standard they've set for what success can actually mean, is the last piece worth examining closely. #1. BTS redefines the standard of success. There is a version of this story where BTS is simply a very successful music group, one that sold a lot of records, filled a lot of stadiums, and generated numbers that will be cited in industry case studies for years. That version is accurate, but it is incomplete. The more significant story is about what the infrastructure of their success built, what it changed structurally, and what it made possible for people who came after them, including, remarkably, themselves. Begin with the Korean language. Before BTS, the conventional logic of the global music industry was that non-English songs could not achieve commercial traction in Western markets beyond niche audiences. This was not a prejudice without evidence. It had been the functional reality of international music consumption for decades. The market had tested the premise repeatedly and returned the same result. BTS systematically disproved it by charting with Korean-language songs on American charts, by selling out American stadiums while performing primarily in Korean, and by building an audience in the United States without English-language radio support. When Dynamite arrived in English and debuted at #1 on the Hot 100, it confirmed what had already been demonstrated, that the audience existed and was willing to follow BTS regardless of language. The precedent they set did not go unnoticed. The doors they opened for non-English language music in Western markets are now walked through regularly by artists they helped make space for. The ripple effects through the K-pop industry specifically were concrete and measurable. Hybe, the company that was Big Hit Entertainment with 20 employees in 2013, used the revenue and credibility generated by BTS to become a major global entertainment corporation. In 2021, Hybe acquired Ithaca Holdings, the management company representing artists including Justin Bieber and Ariana Grande, for approximately $1.05 billion. A Korean entertainment label, built around a single group from a difficult debut, acquired a major American talent management firm for over $1 billion. That transaction was a direct consequence of what BTS had built. The structure of the global music industry changed, in a specific and measurable way, because of this group's trajectory. The influence on Korean culture broadly, what is often discussed under the term Hallyu, or the Korean wave, is harder to quantify but no less real. South Korea's global cultural footprint expanded significantly across the late 2010s and early 2020s, encompassing film, television, food, fashion, and language. Korean language learning surged on platforms like Duolingo during the years of BTS's peak international visibility. The Academy Award for Best Picture in 2020 went to Parasite, the first non-English language film to win that award in the ceremony's 92-year history. BTS and Parasite are frequently cited together, not because they are directly connected, but because they represent twin expressions of the same larger shift in how global audiences were engaging with Korean creative work. BTS did not cause Parasite to win the Academy Award, but they were part of the same cultural moment, and the attention they had directed toward Korean culture over the preceding years was part of the context in which that win became possible. Within their own catalog, BTS's most consequential redefinition of success may be the least visible. They systematically dismantled, through example, the expectation that an idol group should function as a product, polished, interchangeable, emotionally unavailable, and silent on anything that might disrupt the fantasy of perfection. Suga discussing depression and social anxiety disorder in public, in a cultural context where mental health disclosure carries professional risk, changed what was considered acceptable for artists in the K-pop format. The group's openness about doubt, exhaustion, and creative pressure in songs, in speeches, in unscripted moments set a different standard for what honesty between artists and their audience could look like. Other artists in the industry have, in the years since, operated in a space that BTS helped create. The solo chapters of the BTS story, which unfolded as members began enlisting for mandatory military service starting with Jimin in December 2022, extended the group's record-setting into new territory. J-Hope performed at Lollapalooza in Chicago in July 2022, becoming the first Korean solo artist to headline a major American music festival. In March 2023, Jimin's Like Crazy debuted at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the first Korean solo artist to reach that position. In July 2023, Jungkook's 7, featuring Lado, also debuted at #1 on the Hot 100. Two members of a group on hiatus for military service produced consecutive #1 singles on the American chart as solo artists. The platform BTS had built was large enough and stable enough that it continued generating historically significant outcomes even in their absence as a group. The military service conversation itself was unprecedented. The public and legislative debate in South Korea about whether BTS members should receive exemptions from mandatory military service. A debate that reached the National Assembly and prompted an amendment to the Cultural Industry Promotion Act in December 2022, allowing popular culture artists to defer service until age 30, had no parallel in the country's modern history. The fact that the question of 7 musicians' service obligations required a formal legislative response from the South Korean government is a precise measure of the cultural weight those 7 people carry within their own country. When the members complete their service and reconvene, with all 7 expected to fulfill their obligations and reunite around 2025, they will return to a landscape they significantly shaped. The industry is structured differently because of them. The expectations for what an international act can achieve without Western gatekeepers are different because of them. The conversation about mental health, authenticity, and creative ownership within the idol system is different because of them. Success in the music industry is typically measured by chart positions, sales, and awards. BTS has those in quantities that will not be easily surpassed. But the more durable measure is what they changed structurally, what they made possible that wasn't possible before them. By that measure, the numbers are almost beside the point. Almost. 7 facts. 1 group. A story that still isn't finished. What's worth stepping back to consider, now that all 7 are on the table, is how each one connects to the others. Because these aren't isolated pieces of trivia. They form a single, coherent picture of how something genuinely unusual got built over the course of a decade, and why it has lasted as long as it has. The tough start in number 7 wasn't just hardship for hardship's sake. It produced the discipline, the creative ownership, and the specific hunger that made everything after it possible. A group that had been handed resources and a comfortable runway would not have made the choices BTS made in those early years, the aggressive social media presence, the personal lyrical transparency, the willingness to do things differently from what the industry template required. Difficulty shaped the method. The method produced the results. The personalities in number 6 matter because they're real. One of the recurring criticisms of manufactured pop acts is that the people inside them are interchangeable, that the group is a concept rather than a collection of actual individuals. BTS's 7 members are genuinely distinct people with genuinely distinct inner lives, and that has always been visible in the work. The philosophical depth of RM's writing, the raw vulnerability of Suga's solo projects, the perfectionism in Jimin's craft, the unpredictability in V's creative instincts, these aren't performance traits. They're who these people actually are, and the audience has always been able to tell the difference. The detail and meaning in number 5 explains why the engagement with BTS runs so much deeper than typical pop fandom. When a group treats their audience as intelligent enough to find a Hermann Hesse reference, to decode a connection to Ursula K. Le Guin, to follow a Jungian psychological framework across a multi-album arc, the audience rises to meet that. ARMY didn't become one of the most analytically sophisticated fan communities in modern music by accident. They became that because the work consistently rewarded close attention. The global journey in number 4 demonstrated something the industry had not believed was possible and now cannot unknow. Non-English language music can reach number 1 in America. A group with no American radio infrastructure can sell out Wembley Stadium 2 nights in a row. Cultural influence can be built from the outside in, without the permission of traditional gatekeepers, if the foundation with the audience is real enough and strong enough. That knowledge now belongs to every international artist who comes after BTS. The achievements in number 3 are, in the most straightforward terms, historic. Chart records, Grammy nominations, Guinness certifications, White House visits, UN addresses, these are facts. They happened. They are in the permanent record of what this group accomplished, and they will be there regardless of what comes next. No amount of time passing changes what those numbers were. The role of ARMY in number 2 is perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of the entire story, particularly by people outside the fan community. What ARMY did, the translation networks, the charitable campaigns, the organized streaming, the matchmaking between BTS and audiences on every continent, required real effort, real time, and real coordination from real people. The $1 million BLM fundraising match in under 24 hours is not a feel-good anecdote. It is evidence of an organizational infrastructure that most nonprofits and political campaigns would envy. ARMY is not just a support system for BTS. In many concrete ways, ARMY is part of the mechanism that made BTS what they are. And the redefinition of success in number 1 is the fact that ties the other 6 together. Because what BTS ultimately built is not just a record collection or a touring business or a fan base. It is a precedent. A demonstrated, documented proof of concept that the path they took, difficult, unconventional, deeply personal, built on genuine connection rather than manufactured appeal, can lead somewhere that most of the industry had decided was unreachable. They are currently completing mandatory military service. Every member will fulfill that obligation, and all 7 are expected to reunite around 2025. When they do, they will return not to the landscape that existed when they debuted, or even the one that existed when they peaked, but to a world that their own work helped reshape. That is the story that doesn't fit neatly into a chart position or a streaming number. It's the one that takes 7 facts, laid out one at a time, to begin to see clearly. So, ARMY, which of these 7 landed hardest for you? The fact you'd never heard before, or the one you knew but never quite saw in full context? Let us know in the comments. These conversations are worth having, and the people most equipped to have them are watching this video right now. If this gave you something to think about, consider sharing it with a fellow ARMY or with someone who still hasn't quite understood what all the noise has been about. Sometimes the best way to explain something is to let the facts do the talking. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.